Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Sabra, for the introduction. I'm grateful to the National Press Club, to you, Sabra, to Morris Riley, the CEO, and the Board of Directors for having me here today to discuss my new book and the issues it raises about the management of Australia-China bilateral relations at a time of the greatest power shift in modern history across the Pacific from the US to China. Today is a particularly auspicious day to be discussing these things here, as it marks three significant events. First, it is the solemn day of remembrance, marking the end of the First World War, a war in which millions of lives were needlessly lost or injured as a result of a failure of statesmanship and diplomacy. Second, it's the 45th anniversary of the sacking of the Whitlam Labor government. Third, it's Singles Day, 111, a brilliant marketing ploy by China's e-commerce whiz-kid Jack Ma. Over the past decade, Singles Day has grown to become the largest retail event on earth and has been imitated around the world. 45 years ago, when Whitlam was sacked, China was poor, insular, afraid, and still in the last throes of its self-inflicted destructive cultural revolution. The idea of a prosperous, confident, assertive China shaping the global order by virtue of its economic weight alone, of a Jack Ma, let alone hundreds and thousands of them, and e-commerce would have been the stuff of wild science fiction. When Whitlam was sacked, the US had just extricated itself humiliatingly from Saigon. The greatest power on earth, bar none, had been defeated by a ramshackled army of communists and nationalists. With the election of Whitlam in 1972, Australia had asserted an independent foreign policy for the first time in decades. China was immediately recognised, and Beijing was the legitimate government of China for Australian foreign policy. Australia also withdrew from the Vietnam War. Then, as now, until Whitlam's election, Australia's foreign policy had been a subset of US foreign policy. When Whitlam made a visit to Beijing as opposition leader in July 1971, the then Prime Minister Billy McMahon came close to accusing Whitlam of treason, saying Beijing had played Whitlam on a line like a trout. A week later, it was announced that Henry Kissinger was in Beijing to prepare the way for the visit of President Nixon. While Australian and South Korean troops were dying in Vietnam at the side of their US colleagues to keep the Chinese at bay from Southeast Asia, the US changed its foreign policy on a dime without any consultation or forewarning to allies. The Japanese, although without troops on the ground in Vietnam, were mortified that such a thing could happen to the US's allies. It took them many years to rebuild trust with the US. Now, there should be no criticism of the US in this. That is what great powers do in their own interest. Great powers behave as they wish, and the rest of us do what we can. Whitlam paid a heavy price for his audacity in seeking an Australian foreign policy that both respected the alliance with the US, but was independent to reflect Australia's foreign policy interests, not those of the US. 45 years ago today, many Conservatives and foreign policy hawks celebrated the fall of the Whitlam government. It's worth reflecting for a moment that some of the same issues are again at play in Australia today. Fear of China, Reds under the bed, and the struggle for independent foreign and security policies for Australia. The timing of the release of my book could not have been more fortunate. Indeed, some of my critics in the China threat industry, who are easily given to conspiracy theories, will see the hand of Xi Jinping at work here, trying to help me boost sales. This year, things have certainly gone from bad to worse in the bilateral relationship between Australia and China. This time last year, I gave the La Trobe University annual China oration, and things could not possibly get worse. Of course, as we know now, this was yet another of my wise predictions that I got hopelessly wrong. Over a long career, there have been many others, such as in 1985, after a study trip for DFAT to the fledgling Special Economic Zone, Shenzhen, I reported to the Prime Minister that the economics of it were all wrong and it was doomed to fail. Or in 1990, after a week-long trip to Pyongyang, when I concluded my tome of a report by saying that it would just be a matter of a few years before Pyongyang adopted Chinese-style market economic reform. 17 years later, I went there to present my credentials as ambassador, resident at the time in Beijing, and nothing had changed. Fortunately, however, neither of these great calls seem to have been career-limiting. The writing of my book was well underway when the Prime Minister made his ill-judged call for an inquiry into the origins of COVID-19 virus. And the Foreign Minister talked of UN weapons-like inspector flying squads going around the world trampling on the sovereignty of states. Fortunately, we've heard nothing of the latter, any more of the latter. On the inquiry, no one disputed or does dispute the need for one, and subsequently the EU led the work to build an international consensus that eventually saw the WHO membership agree on it. Beijing took umbrage at the way we went about announcing our interest in an inquiry and reacted with its increasingly wolf warrior diplomacy and the threat of economic coercion. From there, the relationship with China has continued to spiral downwards as both sides have engaged in tit-for-tat retaliation. The latest episode has come with Senator Abet's demand for 3 ethnic Chinese Australian citizens who are appearing before a Senate committee asking them to disavow the Chinese Communist Party with echoes of McCarthyism from the 1950s US. In this, he has implicitly questioned the loyalty of Australian citizens of Chinese ethnicity. And then 2 weeks ago, when the Secretary of DFAT was asked in Senate estimates about it, she said that Abetz had merely made a tactical mistake, as his demand could be used against Australia by the Chinese government, rather than rejecting the demand outright as being against the very values we stand by in Australia and are trying to protect. Beijing has since responded with threats of further rounds of economic coercion against a range of products, lobster seemingly to be the most iconic of the list. Writing during the period from just before the Prime Minister's call for an inquiry into COVID-19 and June, when the manuscript was submitted, was full of anxiety as I would flick on News Breakfast every morning, Sabra, and awake to discover the next downturn in Australia's relations with China. In the current situation, bilaterally and globally, as all countries try to adjust to the most massive power shift in modern history, writing a book like I've done is a study of many moving parts. Each new day was filled with anxiety that events would, in some way, overtake the book. So far, however, the central lines of argument, I believe, have held up reasonably well and have been reinforced by subsequent events. Although very current, the book did in fact have its genesis some 8 years ago. I had not long left my position as ambassador in Beijing and retired from DFAT after 27 years. I was living in China and thinking a lot about how the world looked from Beijing's perspective and how Beijing saw its security. China's economy was continuing to surge following the GFC, supercharged by a massive stimulus package of investment into fixed assets, principally housing and construction of infrastructure. Economically, China was moving up the value-added chain, and hundreds of millions of middle-class consumers were being freshly minted. China was soon to overtake the US as the world's leading economy when measured in purchasing power parity terms. It had long become Australia's major market and was streaking ahead of all others in importance. Curiously, DFAT was uncomfortable when I was still ambassador and said such things in public speeches. Our deepening dependence on the Chinese market was to become one of many inconvenient truths about the Australia-China relationship. China was also becoming assertive internationally as it pursued a more muscular foreign policy with its growing economic and military power. Long before Xi Jinping took over in October 2012, China had been asserting itself in the South China Sea, unsettling neighbours like the Philippines and Vietnam, or contesting the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands with Japan. China was busily building up its submarine capacity as part of its aerial denial force, intended to be able to challenge the US in China's coastal waters, naturally with an eye to Taiwan. China had also begun major infrastructure projects in neighbouring countries to connect China's market with supplies of resources from Central Asia and elsewhere. This was long before the Belt and Road was badged as such by Xi Jinping in Astana, Kazakhstan in 2013. I have indulged myself in the book with travel stories and anecdotes, and I'll share one with you that relates to the early origins of the Belt and Road. It's when in September 2006, 7 years before the formal announcement of the Belt and Road initiative, I crossed the border from Xinjiang in far west China over the Kundrab Pass, the highest road pass in the world, into the Hunza Valley in northern Pakistan, and saw along this broken, crumbling, terribly dangerous road, strung out for miles and miles, Chinese surveyors pegging the road for its upgrading. This was to become the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, still one of the key Belt and Road projects today. China was also creating new institutional architecture, which was starting to look like a Chinese order was in the making. In particular, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which was formally launched in 2003, was a significant development which was and remains exclusively anti-Western. It stands against the West. It attracted virtually no attention in Canberra and Washington in the early years of the last decade. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization was quickly followed by the establishment of the BRIC banks, now the New Development Bank, and by 2014, a genuine new innovative piece of multilateral architecture, the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. The debate within the Abbott government split cabinet for 6 months until it was finally resolved that we would join. And the US didn't join, by the way, still hasn't, and neither has Japan because of the US, and it would be the best thing for the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank and everything we want to do with China if Japan were inside, not out. And Kurt Campbell, in his recently published biography, makes the point that it was a great mistake by the US not to join the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. In 2012, Hugh White published what has now become a seminal book on on Asia-Pacific geopolitics, which he called The China Choice. As often happens with such works, it became popular without many people actually having read it. It was widely assumed that the book was about Australia's choice, but it wasn't. The choice was for the US and how to respond to China's rise. But what White said, and we're living through that today, is that depending on the choice the US made, it would have profound implications for Australia, its security, and its ongoing relations with China. Around the time of the China Choices publication, President Obama was announcing his new geopolitical strategy or doctrine, the pivot. This was in effect the US's choice. It was to begin to resist the rise of China. At first modestly and ineffectively, which probably characterises a lot of Obama's foreign policy, until now, where for the US, containing China is the doctrine, no matter how unrealistic that doctrine may be. And Secretary of State Pompeo speaks openly not only of containing China, but putting China back in its rightful place, whatever that might mean. The fateful implications for Australia, if the US was to take the path that it has actually taken, are now playing out today in Australia's relations with China. In my book, I argue that China's grand strategy seeks to ensure China's territorial integrity as defined by the party state and to ensure continuation of Communist Party rule. I argue that it is a defensive, inward-looking strategy. It is not based on notions of exceptionalism and remaking the world in its own image, as is the US's grand strategy. It derives from a position of weakness, not strength. Its origins lie in the conditions under which the Communist Party came to power. As argued in a recent book with the brilliant title, Haunted by Chaos, the communist victors in the Civil War did not take over a state or a nation, but rather shards of territory which they then had to piece together bit by bit into a state. Stability and its opposite, chaos, have been the existential conditions shaping post-1949 China. At times, the party itself has been an agent for chaos, but since the reform and open door policies began some 40 years ago, China has experienced high degrees of stability. And this is something that gives the Communist Party enormous popular support today, and which is so often underestimated by foreign observers.